Today it is easy to buy a jar of pepper for a few dollars at any grocery store. In restaurants, spices are freely available and customers only need to ask to receive them. However, if we go back in time several centuries ago, pepper and many other spices from India were valued as highly as gold or even more so. Why did this happen in human history? What made spices products that now flood the market at extremely cheap prices so incredibly valuable around 2,000 years ago? In this video, let's explore this fascinating story as we let the spices themselves tell us about their journey and how their exorbitant value was shaped by the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the emergence of Arab-Muslim traders, and the steps of Christian crusaders. Please note that the original article, Spices and the Journey of World Expansion by WikiQ on the Spider Room website, was adapted into 2 videos by our team in 2020. However, at that time, due to limited human resources, the Spider team could not produce the most polished product to serve our audience. Therefore, this time we have decided to create a more complete version, gathering all the information to explain why spices once dominated the world market and were as valuable as gold during certain critical historical periods. Now let's begin the main content. The journey to explore the Roman spice trade reveals that one of the most popular spices in the world is black pepper, known in English as black pepper or pepper nigrum. Black pepper originates from southern India and has been used by humans since around 2000 BCE. Mysteriously, pepper made its way from India to ancient Egypt and was found stuffed into the nostrils of Pharaoh Ramses during the mummification process, around 1200 BCE. After Egypt was conquered by Rome in 30 BCE, these exotic spices intrigued the Romans and opened a direct trade route to southern India. The July monsoons brought ships laden with pepper, cinnamon, and fragrant oils from southern India to the Roman trade hub of Alexandria, Egypt, and from there they spread throughout the empire. Indian spices quickly became popular, appearing in about 80% of Roman recipes. They were not only used in kitchens but also in medicine and luxurious needs like perfumes and bath oils for the aristocracy. During this period, spice prices soared to extraordinary levels. Records show that under Roman Emperor Diocletian, around 0.4 kilos of ginger cost the equivalent of 5,000 days' wages for a common laborer, nearly 14 years of daily work without a single day off. The Romans recognized the immense commercial value of spices and organized many maritime expeditions further east in search of them. Notably, one fleet of 150 ships made a voyage from Alexandria to India, China, and Southeast Asia and returned within a year. This route not only created a maritime spice trade serving Roman demand, but also connected the Malacca Strait with Europe. For more than 500 years, toward the end of the 4th century, the Roman Empire split into 2 parts, East and West. While the Eastern Roman Empire continued to prosper, the Western Roman Empire gradually weakened and had to fend off continuous attacks from neighboring tribes, often called barbarians by the Romans. In the year 400, the Visigoths besieged and looted Rome over 3 days, forcing the Western Romans to pay a ransom that included gold, silk, and about 1.4 tons of black pepper. This demonstrated the high value of pepper and spices at that time, comparable to precious goods. Such negotiations only delayed, rather than prevented, the fall of the Western Roman Empire at the end of the 5th century. In the following 2 centuries after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the spice trade continued, but at a smaller scale. By the early 7th century, Islam emerged on the Arabian Peninsula and quickly united the Arab tribes under the faith of Allah. Just as Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes through military power, Muhammad united the Arab tribes through the religion he founded. The Arabs, being astute traders, seized the opportunity to dominate the spice and pepper trade once they controlled the Silk Road. Not only were they skilled merchants, but the Arabs also excelled in science at that time. They pioneered techniques of extraction and distillation to create essential oils from herbs and spices. By the 9th century, Arab physicians combined spices and herbs to produce medicinal syrups extracted from fragrances. By the 10th century, spices imported from Asia skillfully traded and processed by Arab traders, became highly valuable in Europe. Although they no longer commanded the exorbitant prices of the Roman era, for example, 0.4 kilograms of turmeric equaled the price of a horse, 0.4 kilograms of ginger equaled that of a cow, and 0.8 kilograms of nutmeg shells could buy a sheep. Black pepper was even used as a form of currency. King Edward II of England required each German merchant to pay £4 of pepper as a fee to trade in London. Throughout Europe, partly due to a shortage of metallic coins, peppercorns were accepted for paying taxes, rent, and fees. Many ancient European cities chose to store pepper as a reserve asset. The enormous profits from spices contributed to the wealth and transformation of the Arabian Peninsula. Numerous new cities were built, including Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid dynasty and present-day Iraq. The spice trade also inspired many works of Arab literature, most notably the tales of Sinbad the Sailor, a cultural icon of the East. Furthermore, the wealth generated from commerce provided Islam, though founded relatively late compared to other major religions, with a solid foundation for development, and today it has become the second largest religion in the world in terms of followers. Alongside their astute business acumen, the Arabs also spun many mystical legends around pepper and other spices. For example, there are stories about pepper trees protected by 5-colored venomous dragons or dry cinnamon basins guarded by fire-breathing dragons, always mysterious enough to deter any European who dared to venture across long distances to India to find the spices. These tales, though mythological, fit perfectly with the superstitious cultural context of the time and helped the Arabs keep the origins of spices secret while increasing their value and price. The Arabs might have continued to monopolize the spice trade for centuries, if not for the intervention of God. Since the emergence of Christianity, which played a huge role in European society and grew even more powerful in the Middle Ages, the a rapid spread of Islam began to worry the popes. Additionally, Christians making pilgrimages to the Holy Land were heavily taxed by Muslims, sparking outrage among European Christians. In 1095, the Pope and European monarchs and nobles in France, Germany, and Italy officially launched the First Crusade, calling upon the faithful to take up the cross and weapons to recapture Jerusalem and restore Christian control of the Holy Land. Over the next 2 centuries, there were a total of 9 crusades, costing the lives of hundreds of thousands of Christian and Muslim believers in holy wars. Yet at the same time, these crusades boosted trade and exploration to new heights. The faithful who heeded the call of God were no longer intimidated by legends of venomous snakes or flying dragons and had the opportunity to explore new lands, returning, if lucky, with countless exotic goods, among which spices were prominent. The increased supply helped spice prices drop slightly, but more importantly, Europeans broke the Arab monopoly on the spice trade after the Crusades ended in the late 13th century. The spice trade then saw new players emerge, particularly the republics on the Italian peninsula. The descendants of the Romans skillfully exploited the spice routes left by their forefathers, gaining independence in the late 11th century, and, by the 14th century, the Republic of Genoa had become a prominent trade center in the Mediterranean, with pepper as a main commodity. It is estimated that during this period, over 40% of the value of goods imported from Alexandria through the port of Genoa came from pepper. Merchants from Alexandria also brought pepper to their neighbors, including the Republic of Venice, which in the 15th century imported over 400 tons annually, controlling the import of goods and spices into Europe by sea, allowing this republic to set prices at will and become extremely prosperous. Around the same time, in 1453, a major event in European history occurred when the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, fell to the Muslim Ottoman Empire. This gateway to Europe along the Silk Road was now entirely under Ottoman control, and they imposed enormous taxes on goods and spices headed west, driving spice prices to sky-high levels. But at this time, Europeans were already addicted to Asian spices. By the mid-13th century, half a kilogram of pepper was worth 4 silver coins, equivalent to 12 days of a skilled worker's wage. The The prosperity of Genoa, Venice, and the Ottomans made Western European monarchs eager to join this highly profitable spice trade, sparking the birth of new European empires whose influence would extend worldwide. Thus began the Age of Discovery. The first maritime empires emerged as the Ottomans had seized control of the Silk Road, leading Western Europeans to seek a sea route to India by sailing around Africa. During this period, maritime technology advanced significantly. Nautical. Charts had been drawn since the early 14th century, and the astrolabe was invented around 1480, enabling sailors to estimate their position at sea fairly accurately. Nations like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and England invested heavily in shipbuilding technology to launch large, sturdy sailing ships capable of enduring storms and completing multi-year voyages. In 1488, the Portuguese nobleman Bartolomeu Dias and his fleet became the first Europeans to round the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, by ship, unlocking a gateway. 15 years later, a fleet commanded by the Portuguese admiral Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape and landed at Calicut in India. When asked by the locals what had brought him there, Vasco da Gama replied, "For God and for spices." This route transformed Lisbon, the Portuguese capital, into a hub brimming with Asian spices, importing around 2,000 tons annually from India during the 16th century. The Portuguese then sailed even further east to reach the secretive Spice Islands, the Maluku in Indonesia, a supply that had been hidden by Arab traders for nearly 10 centuries. Despite significant losses, about 30% of merchant ships failed to return due to storms and pirates, the Portuguese fleets continued to expand worldwide, turning Portugal into the most powerful maritime empire for the next 4 centuries. Thus, an empire was built on the spice trade. Spain, Portugal's Iberian neighbor, was initially uninterested in the sea route around Africa, believing it unfeasible, especially since it already controlled bustling Barcelona in the Mediterranean. However, after the Portuguese successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the Spanish did not want to miss the lucrative opportunity and accepted the plan submitted by Christopher Columbus, funding his voyage to India in 1492. After more than 2 months at sea, Columbus landed, but not in India as originally intended, but on Guanahani Island in the Bahamas in the Americas. Unaware of his mistake, Columbus returned from his first journey with ships carrying gold taken from the locals and an abundance of West Indian spices. Only upon returning to Spain did he realize the spices he brought back were not Indian pepper, but chili peppers. Columbus's mistake brought him wealth, helped Europeans discover the New World, and transformed Spain into a maritime trading empire, ushering in the Age of Discovery. During the Age of Exploration, the New World was discovered, and Spanish and Portuguese fleets began their voyages of exploration and exploitation of resources. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan's fleet of 5 ships departed from the port of Seville in Spain, aiming to find a new maritime route to the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia by sailing westward through the Americas rather than around Africa. After 3 years, only one of the original 5 ships returned to Spain, carrying 26 tons of spices and only 18 surviving crew members from the initial 237. These 18 men became the first to circumnavigate the globe by sea, though their names are largely forgotten. Admiral Magellan, who commanded the expedition, was killed in a battle with local tribes in the Philippines 6 months before his journey was completed and entered history. Thanks to Magellan's voyage for the next 2.5 centuries, Spain controlled an extensive trade network, establishing the global spice route that connected Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Other European nations soon joined the maritime race. In 1580, Admiral Francis Drake became the first Englishman to circumnavigate the world when he returned to Plymouth with a ship full of spices, marking the start of England's colonial expansion. Another maritime power during the Age of Exploration was the Netherlands, which joined the game relatively late, sending a fleet led by Cornelis de Houtman to the Spice Islands in 1595. The Dutch defeated the Portuguese to gain control of this lucrative region, and the Portuguese spice empire gradually declined after more than a century of dominance. The rise of the East India Companies and capitalism gathered merchants together. The English East India Company was founded in 1600 as one of the first joint stock companies in England and the world, aimed at trading, commercial exchange, and particularly spices from Asia. It was soon rivaled by the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602 to secure Dutch interests in the spice-rich lands of the East Indies. France also established its own East India Company in 1664, mainly operating in the Indian region and competing with the English. As joint stock companies, they attracted investments from various social classes, offering dividends to shareholders and enticing even more participation. The growing trade in Asia yielded immense profits, which fueled fierce competition and aggressive organizational tactics. These companies evolved into political forces with their own armies and increasingly powerful navies. They established local headquarters, developed relationships with indigenous governments, and were ready to use force to protect their trade interests. By the 18th century, when local governments began to resist trade operations and competition from the French East India Company intensified, the British engaged in warfare and quickly won thanks to their superior weaponry, ultimately bringing India under their rule. For over 200 years afterward, in the Malay archipelago of Indonesia, the Dutch East India Company ruthlessly massacred people and burned down nutmeg plantations outside its control to drive up the price of nutmeg and instill terror in other regions. The Malay archipelago and Indonesia remained under Dutch colonial rule for over 3 centuries before falling into Japanese hands during World War II. The establishment of East India Companies marked the irreversible emergence of capitalism. Profits from trade operations amassed vast wealth for shareholders, gradually forming a bourgeois class that participated in politics and used enormous resources to free themselves from the grip of the monarchy. From these trade ventures, capitalism began to emerge and swiftly toppled the 1,000-year-old feudal monarchies, ushering in a new era of the modern world. Spices were indeed expensive, but why were they so exorbitantly priced? By this point, we may have realized how extraordinarily expensive spices were in ancient and medieval times in Europe. Limited supply, high transportation costs, and monopolistic trade control are traditional explanations for why spices were so absurdly expensive compared to their prices today. While these factors are true, they do not fully address a crucial question about the market's supply and demand dynamics. What was the level of demand for spices at that time? This aspect is often overlooked in history books about trade when discussing spices. In his lecture, The Luxury Trade of the Single, at the University of Toronto, Professor John Munro emphasized this issue by questioning the consumption of spices in medieval Europe. Most student responses mentioned the essential, irreplaceable role of spices in preserving meat before refrigeration. However, according to Munro, this seemingly reasonable view is inaccurate because most spices could not match the effectiveness of salt, a far cheaper commodity, in preserving food. Even today, we are only familiar with salted pork and salted beef, rarely encountering peppered pork or saffron pork unless it is a special dish. Moreover, smoking or drying food was also a cheap and effective preservation method. According to Munro, spices in medieval European society were not essential goods, but luxury items catering primarily to the aristocracy and upper classes. Food did not require spices to be preserved, but when cooked with spices, it acquired a distinctive, fragrant aroma that could even inspire new culinary creativity. Spices and exotic flavors contributed to the opulence of meals, subtly showcasing wealth and asserting social prestige. People in the middle and lower classes would never consider exchanging 10 days' wages just for one fancy meal cooked with spices. In a society that heavily emphasized hierarchy and tradition, class distinctions had to be reinforced even at the dinner table. To ensure this, spices had to be extremely expensive. Looking back at history, spices were once absurdly expensive for many reasons. Regardless of why, spices undeniably laid the foundation for the development of trade, set the stage for the spread of Islam, motivated the age of exploration and global expansion, and contributed to the formation of capitalism and today's process of globalization. Nowadays, in a free market governed by natural supply and demand, with widespread cultivation across tropical regions in Africa, Central and South America, and with relative leveling of social classes, the price of spices has returned to their real value as a supplementary food that any of us can access and use. Sometimes when dining, we may find ourselves momentarily surprised to think that these tiny grains of spice once had such a profound impact on the development of the world's history.